Welcome back to the GBC Podcast. We're excited about what we're going to talk about today, which is in Hebrews, now chapter 11. So we've been in Hebrews in our Sunday morning sermon series for a long time now, right? 4 months now, something like that. I've got a couple of months left. Well, no, not quite a couple of months. Well, maybe a couple of months left. So in all,
really, we're just kind of doing a brief overview. We could spend a lot more time on this.
A lot more time on it.
And that's why we're doing this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you sort of dive in a little bit further into some things that we can't really talk about on Sunday morning. And so, which makes it then to Hebrews chapter 11. So I actually did preach dipping into a little bit Hebrews chapter 11. So like the sermon from this morning is verses 1 through 6. And then next Sunday, we'll dip in a little bit further into Hebrews 11 a couple of more times, just a little bit, but really fast forwarding through most of the chapter. Because a while back, we spent some time, our pastors did, covering Hebrews chapter 11, so I'm not doing that again, and so we'll fast forward to Hebrews chapter 12 pretty soon. So there's a lot in my sermon series that I'm really not going to cover, particularly in this chapter, which gives us a great chance to do it here in the podcast.
Because every one of these could be a whole sermon or a whole sermon series on any name listed in this chapter.
Absolutely, because there's name after name listed in Hebrews 11 of people who gave a great example for the writer of Hebrews of a walk of faith of some sort. Some part of their life exemplifies the faith that he begins to talk about in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. And so here's how we're gonna sort of set this up for our podcast. Since we're not jumping into all of those, in particular, I wanted us to take a little bit of chance to maybe grab a couple of these examples of people's lives and how they exemplified the walk of faith and what that means for us. And so I wanted us to grab a couple of those. So I told you to grab a couple, and I don't know which ones you've gotten. I told you which ones I've grabbed. And so let's just sort of do that a little bit. And we may do sort of one at a time and jump back and forth that way. But let me start, though, with Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, which we're familiar with. It's one of the more famous passages in the whole book, and rightly so. It's sort of a definition, as I've described it, not really a complete definition of faith, not a comprehensive definition, but at least a little bit of a definition for it. It says, now faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. So it sounds like he's repeating himself, two different phrases repeating himself about the same thing. It's actually not the same thing. The thing that is hoped for is actually not the same thing that he's talking about that is not seen, just two different things. And so we got into that a little bit in the sermon, so he begins to talk about a little bit about what faith is for a follower of God, right? And so now that he has given us a little bit of a definition of that, now he starts, after verse number 2, he starts in verse number 3 to just sort of give us example after example after example of what that actually looks like lived out in the life of a follower of God. Okay?
And some of them are big, well-known names,
That's
and
right.
some are more obscure, or ones you have to go look up and like, where was the faith on that? It doesn't fit some of our preconceptions.
And some are explained and some are not explained.
Yeah.
So matter of fact, when you get down to some of the like verse 32, verse 33, you get a bunch of names where he says it's actually too short for me to tell you other stories like Gideon and Samson and David and some of these other guys.
And you think David's a big
I know, and he didn't even make it into his story, didn't even make it into chapter 11. So you can sort of tell he gets through a bunch of these stories, and he actually does go through chronologically. And so he gets through a bunch of these stories. It's almost like he just says, okay, I got to stop there, but this is a ton of stories that give us an example of faith, and I just can't name them all. And so here's the names, and he sort of lists some of these names for us. But then after that, he gives us a whole bunch of examples of what he doesn't list any more names. He lists a bunch of consequences for their faith and things that they had to go through. And he mentions a whole bunch of these things, like they quenched the raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, and gained strength. And we all on and on and on he goes about some of these different examples of faith. So it's a really cool chapter, but you sort of do get the sense by about verse number 31, he just sort of goes, okay, that's all I got time for. I can't keep going.
This scroll's getting too short.
It's only so long, right? And so it sort of reminds you of what John says about the ministry of Jesus at the end of his gospel, where John says, look, the books can't contain all that Jesus did and said. I can only choose a certain amount of things to talk about. And I think that's sort of, you get the feel of the writer of Hebrews. He sort of gets to the end of the chapter and he says that it's almost like saying books can't contain the number of stories that and examples of true faith by all of God's followers. And so you sort of have to stop it here with Jericho and Rahab and just sort of mention some other names. So,
and he kind of gives us a key or a lens to go back and look through the rest of Scripture. And we could make our own lists of the same kind of things using this template and go back and look at all of those and be encouraged in our faith by seeing their faith.
That's a good point. And I think partly by doing that, he's telling us that if no matter where you drop in the story, you find a spot, drop into the story in the Old Testament, we ought to be, like, to your point, this ought to train us to see that there is a faith being lived out by God's people everywhere, all through the pages of Scripture, both Old and New Testament. We see that this is a walk of faith, and where God empowers and enables His people to be able to do this by faith. So it's really a cool chapter, and there's so much here. So all right, so let me start. All right, I want to just sort of pick one of these out, and I want to talk a little bit about the story, and then I'll let you go next as an example of faith. So mine comes in verse number 5, my first one, and this is a story that a lot of people are familiar with. It's the story of Enoch. Right, he's got a really cool story. Right, like two people have in the whole Bible, right? So he says, by faith Enoch was taken away, and so he did not experience death. He was not to be found because God took him away. And that's a quote. For before he was taken away, he was approved as one who pleased God. And then in verse 6 gives us another one of those famous passages that we actually talked about on Sunday morning about faith, and he says, now without faith it's impossible to please God. But he just used Enoch as an example of one who did actually please God through faith, or living for God by faith, and he said he gained approval by God. So verse number 5 is a really neat story. We don't get a lot about Enoch. This is about all we get, other than the passage that actually talks about, and there's not any more there.
It's quoting most of it anyway. Yeah, it's almost like another one of those Melchizedek times where
that's right.
Hebrews is telling us as much, if not more, than we actually see in Genesis.
That's exactly right. So we find out way back early in the book of Genesis, we get this long sort of family tree, right? This long description of this person begot that person. So we get this long family tree. Because it's going to lead us up to the time of Noah and all that, and so we're going to need that.
Span the gap between Adam and creation and Noah.
That's right. So when Moses is writing that, he's filling in a lot of those gaps for us. We don't have the stories about all these individuals, and so we come up across this story where we get the story of Enoch, and we find him in this line of people. Now we find out about Enoch that he is actually the father of Methuselah. Now everybody knows Methuselah because he lives 969 years, right? And that's not Methuselah is the oldest person in the Bible, 969 years old. But what's interesting too is that if you go back and look at the story, so Enoch had Methuselah, but Enoch's dad, Methuselah's granddad, lived 962 years old. So just 7 years, right? Mm-hmm. So I mean, what's 7 years among
almost a millennium?
Almost 1,000 years. So it's crazy. I mean, these people were living like almost 1,000 years. And so if you go back before that, the years are much shorter. But Enoch, we assume, may have lived 900 and something years old because his dad did, his son did. But Enoch's life is cut short by experiencing something that nobody else in that whole family tree experienced. Because everybody in that whole family tree, it says so-and-so begat so-and-so, lived this many years, and he died. But Enoch didn't experience that. He's one of the two people really in the Old Testament that didn't experience death. And so it says here that he walked with God. That's what Genesis describes him as a person who walked with God, and then he was not because he was taken. And we don't other than that, we don't really
Right.
know anymore. How? I mean, we know Elijah's story.
Got a chariot.
Yeah, he has a sort of chariot of fire, gets taken up into a whirlwind and a chariot of fire. We get that picture in our head. At least we don't even, I mean, it's hard to even picture that. But Enoch, it doesn't say. It just says he was not anymore. But God took him. And we don't know why. We don't know, we're not given a reason why, other than right here, the fact that he walked with God and that he was approved by God as one who pleased God in his walk, which is another part of the incredible part of the story, because Enoch is stuck in the middle of that whole family tree, and we're not given descriptions of any of those people of how their relationship with God. And now all of a sudden he is walking with God. So we know pre-Abraham, pre-Moses, there were people walking with God.
Before they ever had the definitions of what a sacrifice is, or what a temple was, or the Ten Commandments, any of those things, before any of that, there was someone who understood God's heart.
That's right. And we can only assume, I think, that at least the knowledge of God, of a relationship with God, or the creation, all those kind of things, would have come from Adam and Eve, passed down to Abel and Cain, and eventually their children, their grandchildren, all that, which is, again, part of the reason why we have that family tree, is to give who came after who. We can only assume that the knowledge of God was passed down somehow, because we find in Enoch that he didn't just know God, that he walked with him. He had a relationship with God, enough to have pleased him, pleased God in the way he lived. And then, so for whatever reason, God chooses to do this. He takes him home. He takes him to heaven. And which is really interesting, because if you look at the whole chapter 11, a lot of what is talked about here is like when you get down to basically verse number 13, 14, 15, people were looking ahead to a homeland, something beyond this life, looking to a home with God. And so we can, again, assume that Enoch is looking forward to a homeland, and God takes him on to be in that homeland.
He bypasses all the time between.
It's crazy. So the question then becomes, theologically, okay, so and this is just fun. This is just sort of free for the conversation, but you get people like Enoch and Elijah, right? So everybody else die like now. People die, leave their body behind, their soul goes to heaven, and there they wait for a new body in the end. Where did Enoch and Elijah fit in all that? Their body was assumed into heaven. So where's their body?
They don't have their glorified body yet, you wouldn't think, because that would come at the resurrection.
Yeah.
And
what happened to their physical body? Yeah. It's not here on earth anymore. It got assumed into heaven. Is everybody else that's there right now is sort of disembodied spirit, but they got their body taken with them. So it's sort of this is one of those things.
It's like, we'll just put this over here until it's time to get your glorified body with everybody else.
We don't know. We just don't know. And so that's where you hear the professional theologians say, "Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a clue." Really.
And usually they come up with an answer for everything, but this one,
you just don't know. Okay, so anyway, this is a really cool story about Enoch. We just really don't have a lot about him, but I think it's really interesting that he's included in this story, because you have a lot of, like you said, you have a lot about David, a whole story books about him.
And he's just a name.
He's just a name here. Enoch, we don't have anything about, but he gets a couple of verses in Hebrews 11, so it's pretty cool. All right, so you go. What story are you going to choose?
Looking through, there are lots of them that resonate and are neat, but there's some that I just find interesting in the same way that you mentioned Enoch.
Either way.
Need to say it
right.
appropriately. Sarah. I thought Sarah coming out in this was very interesting. I love seeing her and Rahab as two of the ladies that are mentioned.
Yeah.
But when I look through Sarah's story, and as I read in Genesis, I look at her and I think, but she laughed at God. And he told her some things, and yes, it seemed ridiculous from a humorous perspective, but she laughed. And so in my mind, that's the opposite of faith to some extent. And then you get here, and it almost is like, but it's really referencing how there was faith there. There was expectation there. And Maybe the laughter was more about astonishment and great awe that God would do this after she's past the childbearing years, and just to see how this different angle that I had missed when I read through that story. I just think lack of faith, because she even goes on to deny it. She says, "Oh, I didn't laugh.
I wasn't laughing.
No, it wasn't me. I didn't do it. I didn't laugh." But you did, and he says you did, and he knows that she did, and then this just goes on to talk about her faith in it.
Well, it's interesting if you were to sort of put yourself in a position of somebody who's actually going to start at the very beginning of the story and just read the Bible like Genesis through Revelation, like in order, right? Yeah. There's probably along the way. I've never read it like with these eyes, but if you read the whole book like that, you're probably going to get to the book of Hebrews thinking, okay, there are going to be certain stories you're not going to include as like faith stories, right?
But that's not one of them.
Some are going to fail along the way. Sarah's one of them who's probably going to fail, and there's going to be others who are going to think, yeah, God included you in the story, but yours is not an example, a great example
It's
of
more
faith.
of a what not to do.
Yeah, right. And then you get to the book of Hebrews, and you're like, oh, some of these people are showing up here that you would think, why do they show up in the book, when you would look back at their story and think, yeah, I don't see that as this giant example of faith, yet he includes it here.
Right.
It's really...
It gives us a lot of hope in our lives, because we often think we're so insignificant and when we fail, and yet here she is in this great hall of faith as an example of the faith that she had.
Yeah, and she's not the only one. Again, you mentioned David earlier. You talk about David. There are going to be a lot of stories in his life, especially or there's other ones too. I mean, he had all kinds of problems. I mean, not only did he have the biggest problem with having an affair, he committed murder by proxy, basically, and then he has all kinds of problems with his family, his sons, and
which implies his parenting skills to some extent.
Death and all that kind of stuff which is why he doesn't get to build the temple and all this other kind of stuff. But then his name shows up. You think, that guy was a normal guy who looks a lot like me. I mean, failure after failure kind of. But at the same time, there's something in their story that the writer of Hebrews is grabbing a hold of to say, look, the walk of faith, if we could put it this way, the walk of faith is not a walk of perfection. It's a walk of believing, holding on to the promises of God. Even at times we doubt that, even at times we mess up, even at times we turn away from God, we choose the wrong things. But the walk of faith is a walk where we hold tightly to the promises of God, and we believe Him, and we get through this life, as imperfect as it is, we get through this life holding on with all we have to the promises of God. And that's what I think the writer of Hebrews, at least one of the things he's trying to draw our attention to with people like Sarah.
Right.
She laughed at God. But her story here is included as an example of faith. So, all right, so let me fast forward, go to like the middle of the chapter. So verse 27, this is a story about Moses. Moses is mentioned several times, which he gets the bulk of the chapter, if you're talking about one individual, which, I guess if you're Moses, you can have that, right? you get the bulk of the chapter.
He is one of the standouts in the whole Scripture.
That's right. And so, I've always explained it this way when I talk about Moses. Moses was really their hero. I mean, he's the Old Testament hero. Like the way I've described it for people in the past is like every Hebrew boy would have had a poster of Moses on their wall.
Right. Even though there was Father Abraham and kind of the father of everybody, there's still something special and set apart about Moses.
Yeah, he's their deliverer, all right? He's the one that rescued them from bondage. So he gets a bunch of these verses. So if you look in verse 27, which is sort of the middle part of his story, by faith it says he left Egypt behind, not being afraid of the king's anger. For Moses persevered as one who sees him who is invisible. Now, that's part of, again, the message of the whole chapter, is that the one who has faith is the one who has eyes to see what is invisible, right?
Which goes right back to the beginning of the chapter.
Right. Part of the definition is the eyes of faith are, and a lot of people say faith is blind, right? You just just walk through this life and like you can't, like it's just blind. You can't. Well, that's the opposite of actually what Hebrews says. Hebrews says no, real faith sees. And although we can't see with our physical eyes what God has promised, a faith literally grabs a hold of what God has promised as if it is tangible. It's not, we can't hold it in our hands, but faith acts as if it is. Faith grabs a hold of it.
We're taking the steps depending and trusting that it is real, even though our senses don't say it's there.
That's exactly right. So that's what faith is. Faith is grabbing hold of what God has promised as if it is real. It's in our hands. It is real, but as if it is tangible. So it says here that Moses is able to go before the king, and we find out here, I think what he's saying is, and we can often question as we go back and think, man, how did Moses have that kind of courage to go before Pharaoh? Like multiple times, over and over again.
You think the first time he was going to be scared, he's going to be killed.
That's right. Like, Charlton Heston, let my people go. That's still the image I see in my head. Do you see that image in your head when you read Moses? Whatever. I mean, I'm still stuck in the Ten Commandments, the old Ten Commandments, right? Let my people go, and he does this. He does this over and over again, multiple times. What kind of courage does that take, and where did he get that from? Well, the writer of Hebrews says that Moses persevered as one who sees him who is invisible. So it's as if Moses is gaining the strength to go before the king, before Pharaoh, in his anger, not be afraid, because Moses saw something else, something bigger than Pharaoh. Which really, again, going back to David, I mean, look at David's story. David goes out to fight Goliath, right? Who wouldn't be scared?
Right.
But David, in his own words, David saw something bigger than Goliath. How dare you mock the armies of God? David is, in a sense, saying, you're a big dude, but I see something much bigger than you, and that was God. And so Moses, in a sense, is standing before Pharaoh, but Moses sees something that is invisible. He's seeing, as if with his eyes, he's seeing with the eyes of faith, something much bigger, which is God, which gives him the courage then. So it says, by faith he instituted the Passover, sprinkling the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch the Israelites. By faith they crossed the Red Sea as though they were on dry land. When the Egyptians attempted to do this, they were drowned. Over and over again. So he's given little snips of multiple stories here, and it says at the beginning of every one of those verses, by faith he did this, by faith he did this. And that happens over and over again through the chapter. By faith. So he's wanting us to see that the way these things were accomplished as the people of God were walking with him was by faith. They live by faith. And so at the end of chapter 10, so draw our attention back to chapter 10, which we preached a couple weeks ago. Chapter 10, verse number 38, the writer of Hebrews quotes a passage in Habakkuk where he says in Habakkuk chapter 2, but my righteous one will live by faith. So it's not an accident that he ends chapter 10 with that verse. My people will live by faith, and then chapter 11 shows us what that looks like. That's right. So they're doing this by faith. Their eyes are seeing what is invisible, and that's what he's called us to do. So live by that kind of faith. All right. So that's my second one. What's your second one?
We have to go back in time a little bit.
All right.
Back up the page. We're going to look at Joseph. And how Joseph, as he's preparing for his death, he's been in Egypt all these years. He has been the rescuer of the people during famine and helped prepare a way for them and to preserve the line. And now he's ending his life in Egypt. He's blessed his sons. In all of his blessings, he's looking forward to the return to the promised land and the promise that he has. So there's much forward looking for him, to the point where he even says, when you all leave, take my bones with you. And again, just such a very interesting piece, because theologically we're going to assume he knows those bones really didn't mean anything. They're not really worth anything. They're not going to do anything. But there's still this forward looking of a return. We're going back to that promise. We will be there together. That's where God's blessing is, where God's purpose is. take me out of this land of death. I mean, think about the culture of death, really, that Egypt had to put all that effort and time into embalming and pyramids, and so much of their culture, it seems, was built around death.
That's right.
So take me out of the land of death. I need to go back to the land of promise. I need to go from death to life, from where we are to where God has promised, and that looking forward to the point of, and take my bones with you.
You know, and all of that, he's claiming a promise given to Abraham, which, you know, you basically you've got a land secured, or a land there. You know the land is there, but it's not in their possession yet. And he's looking forward to the day when it would be. So take my bones with you when you actually finally get there. There's so much of this that are. I mean, I preached a funeral, as a matter of fact, this morning, where I'm talking about, or this week, I'm talking about this, like verse 13 through 16, where it talks about how all of these people, he's talking about Old Testament saints, all these people die in faith. They had not received the things promised yet, but they were looking ahead to something else, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth, that they're looking forward to something that God had promised. And all of these people are looking ahead. But as I reminded in that funeral, they were all looking forward. We are still looking forward. But their promises were anchored to Jesus, which is the point that the writer of Hebrews is trying to make through the whole thing. All those promises that were forward-looking anchored forward to Jesus. For us, our promises are still looking forward. We're still waiting on that homeland. But for us, that promise is anchored backwards to Jesus. All of these things, whether it's Old Testament saints or New Testament saints, everything is anchored back to the same person, and it's all in Jesus. Our hope ultimately for a homeland is in Him, and is in the hope that we will be with God. We will be with Him in His presence. So, man, it's incredible. All these different stories, and there's tons of them. I mean, we can do this like all day, right? There's a lot of these stories about faith, but the ultimate thing that he's trying to get us to is to say, this is what faith is. Faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not yet seen. Now, here's how you live that life. You walk with God like Enoch did. You trust God's promises ahead like Joseph did. You keep walking with Him, and our hope for all of these things is anchored to Jesus, because He's better. He's better than all of these other things that they were looking for, hoping for. Jesus is better than all that. So anyway, and a great chapter. It's fun. We could do this. We could keep going, but we won't. So anyway, next time we'll get into maybe a little bit more of Hebrews chapter 11 before we move further into Hebrews chapter 12 and the end of the book. All right. So
great.
That's GBC Podcast. We'll see you next time.